Welcome to Sports Management Podcast, where you will hear interesting sports management professionals share their stories, experiences, and passion for the sports management industry. I am your host, Marcus Philipson. Welcome to episode 162 of Sports Management Podcast. Today's guest is Mark Hewlett, the co-founder of Soul Padel. Mark has a background from food retail and has worked for Lidl in the UK for many years. In 2023, he decided to start Soul Padel after seeing its potential as a sport on the rise. Soul Padel wants to bring padel to people from all walks of life and democratize the sport and ensure all comers can pick up a racket. We spoke about democratizing padel, the importance of proper coach education, padel as an Olympic sport, Soul Padel's partnership with Decathlon, the biggest challenge in growing padel in the UK, being recruited by the government to help during COVID, and much more. Mark Hewlett, welcome to Sports Management Podcast.
Thank you, and thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show. You are the founder and CEO of Soul Padel. So can you tell us a little bit about this company?
Yeah, absolutely. We're a relatively new company. We were founded in the back end of 2023. And the vision for Soul Padel is to welcome everybody to the court. And we have three values which are very close to everything that we do. They are meet, play, and connect, because we believe padel has a wonderful opportunity in the UK to become a mass participation sport. To do that, though, it's got to be more accessible. So the purpose for our clubs are to be community embedded very much in the heart of the communities in which we operate. And what we're looking to do is to scale that model to as many places as we can and as many parts of the UK as we can.
So obviously I'm in Sweden, and padel here boomed very heavily during COVID and now has declined. It was too rapid of a growth, you could argue.
Yeah.
So now when you see it from a UK standpoint, how do you see the growth of padel in UK?
Look, there's lots of hype around padel. It's the new kid on the block. It's a fast-growing sport, and it's attracting a lot of interest. But there are fundamental market dynamics that will dictate how fast it can grow. Space requirements, planning restrictions, construction costs, coaching availability, general public awareness of what padel is and the benefits over other sports. The UK is still very much at a foundational stage, in my view. It will grow. It will see sustained growth, I do believe. And it may not experience the same boom and bust scenario that happened in Sweden. And it may not grow as quickly as it did in Sweden, but it will continue to grow because fundamentally it is a sport that everybody can play. And the UK has a problem with health, fitness, obesity levels are high, physical activity generally has declined, particularly amongst children. And sport needs to become more affordable, more importantly, and more accessible. So if padel can play that role, it's got a really good chance of being a really strongly growing and successful sport in the UK.
I agree. And you mentioned before to connect was one of the words. And I feel like padel has taken over from golf a little bit when it comes to that type of connectivity, with the difference of what you mentioned, that it's easier. There's a smaller barrier to entry. It's easier to pick up a padel racket than to learn how to play golf, and also arguably more affordable padel versus golf.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to compare those two sports, but I can see why those analogies have been drawn. If you look at sport generally, if you take the England football team, for instance, most of the players on that team came from what we would call lower socioeconomic or disadvantaged backgrounds. The reason kids can get into football is because it's easy. You need a football and somewhere to kick a ball around. Other sports, I think, have started to see participation decline because they're technically quite difficult to learn. So therefore, it's expensive to be coached. The equipment you need cannot be hired often or needs to be bought, and that's expensive. And then you've got this very British kind of hierarchical system that goes on in existing clubs where members only, if you're not from a certain background, you can't join, you have to be recommended into the club. If you put all that to one side, padel has got an awful lot going for it. It's a sport that anybody can play. It's not expensive. It shouldn't be anyway. But I think it's got the potential to have an image problem in the UK if it's not careful, where clubs are in affluent areas. Those people with time and money are able to play. How do we change that? And part of what we want to do going to market is to make sure our paddle clubs are in places where there are no barriers, there is no hierarchy, there is an acceptance and a warm and welcoming feeling when you come and play with Soul Padel. To do that, we've got to take a different strategy than some of the other operators that have come into the market, and I'm prepared to do that. I would say my background primarily is in retail, so I worked for Aldi and Lidl for a combined 15 years. We want to be the Aldi and Lidl of paddle. People love them. They associate with the brand because it's affordable, it's accessible, and it's seen as a cool place to be because you're being smart by going there. It's a real ambition of ours that we always are democratizing access to paddle.
That's interesting. And you mentioned the image problem there, and you said you want to make it affordable, but it takes more, I guess, to change an image if it's seen as a rich person's sport. So what other actions are you taking except for making it more available and a bit cheaper?
Yeah, I think you look at the types of people that you're looking to get into the sport, and if kids aren't involved, the sport's got no future. So 20,000 juniors playing a sport every week creates one world-class professional. If we've not got kids and we're not attracting kids to the sport, we'll just be the next squash, and paddle can't afford to do that. The way we design our clubs, how we build them, we are looking to value engineer absolutely everything so that the rates that we will charge to use our courts will be lower and will be constantly kept low, because our economic model and our fiscal models will be different to others. The rents that you will pay in the UK to take large warehouse space, for instance, and then the rates on top of that mean that the break-even position is higher, so therefore your charge rates are significantly higher. We don't want to go down that road. There is plenty of land in the UK that is already zoned for sport, recreation, and development that isn't used at the moment. So thinking differently about where you put your club, how you build it, and then how you operate it will, I hope, and I think, make it constantly affordable and accessible. But if I go back to the brand perception of paddle, if all we see is people dressed in white playing at high-end London clubs with celebrities, then the sport's got an image problem, because it's then seen as an aspirational sport that has barriers to entry, and therefore it detracts the everyday person from getting into the sport potentially. Now, I'm not suggesting that's the case across the entirety of the UK market, but there is a potential, if the sport is not carefully governed and managed, that we have a problem with our image.
That's a good point. And of course, the grassroots is an important piece as well. And with that means that you need good coaches and maybe like these type of things as well.
We have got a relationship at the moment with a Spanish academy called M3. They're based in Madrid. Their coaches are with us right now for 4 weeks. And the reason we've gone there is that we want to credibly stand behind our coaching program. To do that, though, at the moment in the UK, it's hard to find domestic coaches that are appropriately trained and have the experience. Our relationship with M3 will not just be bringing coaches in, because that's expensive. It will be to train the trainers so that we learn from them the techniques, the skills and experiences, so that we can pass that on to our own coaches, who will then be working, within our clubs. Coaching in the UK is a problem. And we've seen that already from the people who are using our club at Stockport, that there's an overwhelming desire to understand the game better, to understand match play, and to get better technically. But there is a real dearth of the right types of coaches to go to.
But that makes sense, right? Since it's a new sport, it's difficult to have that type of knowledge in a new sport.
Exactly. Yeah, it makes it difficult.
But then it's great that you have that partnership with the Spanish club. Another partnership that you have that is really interesting is with Decathlon. So can you speak a little bit about that partnership?
Yeah, so I guess, from my retail background, I looked at the landscape in the UK as to where can clubs be profitable and be successful, and where is the space. And the UK probably is very similar across continental Europe. Every town has out-of-town retail malls. some of those over the last few years have been less successful. So space has become available, and we approached Decathlon about 6 months ago. We liked their vision. We understood their philosophy. I would personally had shopped there before. They have a very successful paddle brand in Europe that they weren't necessarily promoting as much in the UK. So we are looking to take permanent space at their clubs, but as part of a promotional campaign, we wanted to put temporary summer club next to their stores. And they were very receptive to that and understood the mutual benefits. But for them, it's more than just a financial uplift in the sale of rackets. It's how do we activate sport? How do we get people active? And to do that, visualizing a game when you arrive at a store like Decathlon, it's really kind of motivating. We have people just stood there watching our courts constantly and trying to understand what paddle is first and foremost. And then they go into Decathlon and they may not spend money on paddle, but they'll buy something else that, keeps them active and gets them playing a game. So it's working really well. It's a relationship that we certainly have every intention to strengthen because we like them. They're a great brand.
Yeah, and a well-known brand, of course, and a great initiative, as you said, maybe in a bigger scale as well, also in from a health perspective.
Yeah, exactly. They've got a very clear vision to make as many people as possible active and playing sport. And they've done some really smart things recently with the Tour de France entering their own team. They sponsor the Olympics this year in Paris. And they're raising the awareness of what they do as an organization. It's not just about selling sporting equipment.
So talking about Soul Padel, how do you see the future in UK and beyond?
Yeah, look, the UK market for us is very exciting. We've got, let's say in round numbers, about 50 sites that we're working on at the moment, various stages of development from feasibility through to just about to submit for planning consent. We think there is strong growth. We have identified 4 very specific channels to market. The retail adjacency with Decathlon is one. We've got partnerships developing in the private leisure sector. We are working with local authorities on that spare land concept we talked about. And then importantly for us in the education sector. So we're embedding ourselves within university sport, higher education, and working with organizations that facilitate or better manage the facilities that exist within the education sector. And they're going through a tough time at the moment. There'll be changes in policy in the UK from a government perspective. So the more that the education sector can do to leverage its own assets and get the public more involved, the better it is for their commercial success. So we see those 4 channels to market as being the first phase of our development rollout. We're less interested in converting tennis courts to paddle courts. We're less interested in taking on industrial space and converting that because, the UK landlords get good money from industrial users, particularly with the growth in online shopping. The rents have really kind of stacked up over the last 5 years. And there's a break-even position that is very hard to achieve, I think, with some of the rents that I've been quoted. So we're pretty happy with where we are. We've got a very good board and we've got investment behind us to stimulate the growth that we aspire for. Beyond the UK, without getting too ambitious too soon, we've registered Soul Padel in Australia. I spent 8 years there. I'm an Australian citizen. So we've got a subsidiary organization set up. We've appointed a director to do a market entry review and create a strategy for us. Australia is a very, very early market for paddle. I think there's only 37 courts or less than 50, let's say. We think that the Aussies will love paddle. They're very sporty. I've got 3 daughters and they spent a lot of time in the Australian sporting infrastructure. They do it better than anyone, I think, in kids sport. So we're really excited about Australia and what Soul Padel might be able to do down there.
Yeah, definitely. Really exciting. And just to back up a little bit to the educational piece that you mentioned, to get into college sports and so forth, but also is it to try to get it into the PE maybe in the lower educational class as well?
I think it's important that it becomes part of a curriculum. If you look at school sport generally, the traditional sports are all there. short format or different format sport is starting to become extremely popular. If you look at the Olympics in Paris, the types of sport now that are qualified and recognized as Olympic sports will change dramatically in the next decade. And if you look at the success of short format cricket, short format rugby, I think paddle has a really big role to play in bringing kids in because it's exciting, it's different, and it's, as I say, the barriers are lower. So if we can get kids playing paddle at school, there's a very strong chance then that you'll have them playing outside of school in leagues, at clubs with their parents, and so on and so forth. So if it's not in education in the UK, I would find it difficult for the UK to support a professional circuit. I think it would be difficult for the UK to support an Olympic team over a long period of time. So that's a big part of what we want to do.
And of course, the Olympics is a huge stage, and you mentioned there for paddle as an Olympic sport. So is that something that you think is on the horizon?
It seems to be. I mean, what I read and what I understand is that the target is Brisbane in 2032, which would be good for me and Soul Padel if we're there by then. It may happen sooner. There's certain qualifications that it's got to achieve, and numbers of countries playing, numbers of regular participants globally. But if you look at the Olympic lineup this year in Paris, there's no reason why paddle can't make that.
Maybe you're a step ahead here with the Soul Padel in Australia if they come in 32.
Well, there are other people looking at the same markets we look at. People speak a lot about the US, obviously, and the growth over there and the potential that's ahead. I do believe it will be a big sport in the US. Australia is a country of 26 million people. More or less all of them are sporting fanatics. And paddle has a very strong chance of being part of that sporting ecosystem.
So the paddle industry is huge, and the potential is even bigger. And I read the report from Deloitte and Playtomic that they said that the paddle ecosystem is expected to be worth $2 billion by 2026. So obviously there is interest.
There is interest, and I read different figures from 5 billion to 2 billion. And I think the most recent Playtomic report came out a couple of weeks ago, and it estimates even more growth ahead. If you look at the number of courts that have been added every week, the number of clubs that come online every week, even in mature markets, the growth is still continuing. I mean, I think Spain has probably reached its plateau and maturity, but even there, clubs are getting redeveloped and enlarged, and the offer is improving. I think the potential for the different segments of growth in club operations, court supply, equipment, merchandise, sponsorship. If the Qatari Sports Investment Fund and Red Bull have taken on an international interest in paddle, then that tells you a lot about where the sport might be going and where the growth might be coming from. I think it's a fascinating market, and I feel very privileged to be involved in something like this because I see it as a once in a lifetime opportunity.
How do you see competition with other sports? Do you feel like you are competing with tennis, squash, pickleball, or do you think that a tide rises all boats?
I hope it's the latter. I don't see why racket sports should see each other as competition. Most of the people I speak with at our club play multiple racket sports, tennis, squash primarily. I'm noticing more people playing pickleball in the UK. I think that sport will continue to grow. That's very, very accessible. So it needn't be a competition. And I can see over time where clubs will have multiple options for people to play different sports, not necessarily just racket sports. I think there's a coexistence with other sports, whether it be a gym or Pilates or, something that's more traditional. Rugby clubs are building paddle courts, cricket clubs are building paddle courts. So I think there's this symbiosis of, if everybody is getting physically active, regardless of what they're playing, then it's got to be better for the nation. Paddle in particular needn't see itself as competition. It is a new sport. Tennis will look at paddle nervously, I think. But if paddle can help tennis, great, and vice versa.
I hope so too. I really do. What would you say is the biggest challenge for growing paddle in the UK?
Yeah, I think I've touched on a few of these. Space is at a premium on a very crowded island. There's 70 million people that live on the British Isles. There isn't a lot of space. So we have to be clever about how we use space, and we need to think very laterally and innovatively. The cost of operation in the UK is high. We are a high cost operation. When it comes to building materials, land is at the premium, wages are high. So we just need to be mindful about how we go about the economic and fiscal model that we build. So space, cost. The planning laws in the UK are bureaucratic, archaic, and are in desperate need of renewal. And my hope is with the new government, there'll be a serious review of the planning laws in the UK so that it would facilitate and stimulate development. We know we've got a problem with our nation's health. We know that we are more obese and less active than we were 20 years ago, but yet it's harder to build places for people to be fit and healthy than it ever used to be. So we have to change the system. The system has to recognize that. And then you've got the challenge that we spoke about earlier, which is the development of the sport technically and encouraging people to get coached and trained. How do we do that when we're a new country with less coaches, but more people wanting to play? They are the four problems I see, all of which can be resolved, none of which will prevent growth, but you have to recognize what's ahead of you.
I really hope that, padel will grow, because I love padel, play it myself. And it's great to hear that, Soul Padel is trying to help out with many of these challenges.
Yeah.
If we focus on you a little bit, I'm interested in your story and your journey. So how did you get into the sports industry, and what's your career journey up until this point?
So I'm a fourth generation retailer. My great grandmother had a newsagent's tobacconist on the docks in Liverpool, a business that she started in 1914. My grandfather then took on that business. My father went into business, but completely different. He was into clothing, apparel, retail and wholesale. And then I became a retailer, but I worked for the family business for a while. And then I went to work for Lidl, the German discount business, back in 2001. And I took a decision that I wanted to find my own way. And I spent plenty of time wondering whether I'd made the right decision. But then ultimately it was. I had a brilliant career that took me from the UK all over the world. I've lived and worked in Germany, Australia, China, the US, and I've seen every facet of retail, but always in food. I've always been into food retail. And I've seen the property development side, the commercial buying side, the logistics and supply chain, the retail operations. I've been involved in the creation of new concepts, new formats, whether that's physical or online. And then, as everybody had during those weird years in the pandemic, things changed for me. We were in Melbourne at the time, and the pandemic was quite severe. Lockdown was brutal. And the business I was working for decided it was going to leave Australia and head home. So we were left in a position where we had a choice to make with three girls, no family support, not able to fly in or out of the country. We made the decision to leave and go back to the UK. And that was a tough decision. As I say, we were Australian citizens, and we just moved to Melbourne. We'd bought a home. We were renovating the house. So it was a tough call. And literally 2 weeks before I left, I was contacted by the UK government and asked to help with the COVID test and trace program. And I ended up being the chief operating officer for the testing side of COVID, which is a massive pivot from food retail to COVID testing. But the concept of the testing program was that this was a product that needed to be available ubiquitously across the UK. So creating channels to market. So we had an online testing program, we had a mobile testing program, we had physical sites that you could drive to, walk to. And then there was all of the laboratories and logistics and digital interface that was created around that. So it was 18 months with the government of intense, like unbelievably intense pressure, but it was enjoyable. And I learned a lot, and I met some amazing people. I then worked for a private company for another year, and then decided I got to 45, and there's been a niggle inside me for a long time that I need to do something for myself. So I took some time away. And really, my passion has always been sport and physical fitness. I still play rugby. I still play cricket. I still play paddle. So with the girls growing up a little bit, being slightly less dependent on us, we decided to found Soul Padel. I spent probably 12 months looking at paddle, 6 months very seriously researching paddle, and then we founded the company. And I'd experienced it in Portugal. I've been going backwards and forwards for years and loved playing the game, but I always thought this is a European sport that can only be played in the sunshine with your family when you're on holiday. But then things started to, come onto the radar in the UK. Paddle started to make the press. Clubs started to appear. So I looked at it and thought there is definitely business potential here. There's commercial potential, but I needed to know more. So, as I say, spent a lot of time researching before we started to seriously get involved. And Soul Padel's genesis, the soul in the paddle, goes all the way back to its Latino spirits of it's warm, it's welcoming, it's friendly. Everybody should be able to play. It's a communal club that we wanted to create. So the name really kind of took hold, and we all bought into that. And then it was a case of, okay, let's develop the strategy. Let's talk to investors. Let's work a property network strategy out, and let's go to market. And we've achieved things very quickly, much faster than I expected. But I guess that's part of this energy that is around paddle in the UK at the moment. And sometimes we've got to pause and reflect and look backwards on what we've achieved and breathe a little before we go again, which is kind of where we are now, just about to take on our second round of investment with 6 sites just about to go through the planning process. We're at a really pivotal moment for Soul Padel, and we're all really proud of what we've achieved. We're still a very, very small team with a very large ambition, but it doesn't feel like work anymore. There's a different feeling to what I'm doing, which I've never had before, which I guess is a good thing.
Yeah, that's what they say, right? That you have found something that you love to do. Then it doesn't feel like work.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's good. It doesn't mean it's not stressful, but different stressful.
Of course. So backing up a little bit to the COVID part, you said the government reached out to you. So why you? Why do you think that they chose you for this mission?
It was a really weird conversation, and the guy who rang me was from a retail headhunter, which is normal. I spoke to headhunters all the time. And when he said, look, we'd like you to consider this role, I thought he was joking. I said, you've got the wrong guy. I'm not a scientist. I don't know anything about virology, epidemiology, or virology. So he said, look, no, we've got all those people. What we need is someone who can get stuff done. Let's be really clear. The UK needed to build its testing infrastructure. It was caught out. It was underprepared. And people like me joined the program because it was mission driven. How can we help? How can we bring the skills and experiences from different parts of the economy together to solve an enormous challenge? So it wasn't necessarily going to be solved from within. So the NHS was under pressure, it was under stress, and it needed to cope. So we as outsiders came in and helped with the challenge. So we brought things like operational development, real estate, construction, supply chain, all the things that were necessary. And it was a really unique project. And I think it was a really good example of a country solving a problem by thinking differently and bringing skills and experiences from all over the world together to solve what was, I'd say, post-war, the biggest infrastructure development project that's ever been undertaken to solve the biggest challenge the UK had. And I'm really proud and privileged to have been a part of that, but it was a complete sidestep to what I'm used to.
Yeah, I understand that. What are some learnings you think that you've taken from this that you can implement in Soul Padel?
I think rapid growth and rollout of infrastructure was something that was just desperately urgent. Now, we're not in that same position, but we took a very formulaic approach to our test site development. There was 4 concepts as I've described them. There was large drive-through centres, small local walk-up centres. We had mobile testing in vans, or ambulances. And then we had an online channel that you could order tests and get them delivered to your home. And then there was a pickup and collection service. So being really kind of formulaic around that's the strategy, how do we roll that out? And understanding two things, channel to market and then format by channel, is very important for me now when we look at the paddle development that we've got ahead of us. Which are our channels to market and what format do we want by channel? The other thing that I learned is that you can always learn something from everybody, no matter where they're from. Now, I never would have thought I would interact with the Prime Minister of the UK or lords, dames, and the higher echelons of government, speaking with government ministers and then chief scientific officers and the person that runs the NHS in the UK. I learned an awful lot just from those interactions. And so I bring to Soul Padel an attitude that I don't need to talk to everybody inside paddle. I need to have people from outside of paddle helping me. So if I look at my board, I've got someone from the hedge fund financial sector. I've got someone from the leisure and gym sector. I've got someone from an operational background with lots of global experience in retail. Paddle can learn a lot from that because I think sometimes it's a bit of an echo chamber. We hear a lot about paddle. We talk to a lot of people about paddle who are also involved in the paddle sector. I think if it's really successful, paddle can learn a lot from lots of different parts of the economy in different sectors. So yeah, there's some of the things that have changed me definitely, and for the better, I hope.
Yeah, I would assume. And I like that mindset that you said that you can take a lot of learnings from outside of sports. And many people I've spoken to on this podcast that they have been working for one specific sport. So I know the Table Tennis Federation, they were talking a lot with the Ice Hockey Federation and how can they take learnings. But also outside of the sport industry, as you said now.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, if you look at some of the football clubs in the UK that have been bought recently, the American sport franchise concept has made its way to the UK, and you can see the changes in clubs like Liverpool, where that concept of brand outreach program, how do we broaden our audience, how do we attract more women, more younger members of society, that's a positive influence on UK football. And I don't see any reason why a sport should always just focus on itself. It has to have its head up, looking around at what's successful elsewhere. Cricket in the UK is a really good example of how it's changed so much in 20 years by looking at why is baseball so successful in the US? Why are other sports going to short format and having success? And it's learned and it's adapted. And now you've got kids and girls. My daughter, 13, her favorite sport is cricket. It's all she wants to play. That would never have happened 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So paddle's got to constantly make sure that it's relevant. And to do that, it's got to learn from elsewhere.
I love that. Being in business and executive positions and now in sport for many years, what's the best advice you would give someone who wants to pursue a career in sports?
Do your homework and do your research, because it may be your passion and you might have played that sport forever, but can you be successful making money from the sport? And ultimately, if you want to get into sport for a business purpose, you have to make money. It's a number one rule of any business. It can't just be, I love tennis, so therefore I'm going to open a paddle club because I think I can do the same thing there. And there are lots of people who have that ambition, I'm sure. But the research that you need to do, I mean, the fiscal analysis and the pulling apart of numbers that we've gone through in Soul Padel, I have not hardly spent any time on court at all because I'm looking at this differently. And I didn't get into this because I want to be the best 45-year-old paddle player. My advice would always be to understand the numbers and the detail in intimate levels of understanding. And if you still are passionate after you've done that and you want to get into it, surround yourself by brilliant people who can help and advise and guide you. Don't try to do everything on your own. You will only have limited levels of success. At times it can be lonely, and you think that you question your judgment, and it's really, really important that those around you are supportive, primarily and fundamentally your family. if your family is with you on the journey and is also passionate about what you're doing, you've got a fighting chance of being successful.
More entrepreneurial advice, I interpreted this.
Yeah, it is. I mean, look, everybody goes into business with a vision to be successful. No, everyone thinks they're going to build a successful organization. And if you're driven by profits only, you may see some success. But I think if you've got more of a deeper connection and your vision is brought alive in the culture you create around you, success will come your way and profits will follow. But you've got to have that mindset from the outset. A lot of people are looking at padel as a get-rich-quick scheme. And how do I get into it as fast as I can and get out as quickly as I can and make some money doing so? And yeah, there will be people who'll do that and they'll make money and they'll be, successful. However, that's not good for the sport. And if we want the sport to be a prosperous and successful addition to the UK sporting scene, operators like me need to have a model that works. And it will work if people want to play at your club, fundamentally. And I hope and I think that is the way the UK market will go. Some people will fall by the wayside. And it may be that we're not successful and my vision is wrong and nobody wants to be involved in a community operation. I hope not, but my vision will remain true to its origins, which is to welcome everybody to the court.
I love that. So if the listeners want to read up more on Soul Padel or get in touch with you, follow you on social media, where can they do that?
Well, we're going through a complete brand overhaul at the moment. So if you go to our website, you'll see the old version, but it's www.soulpadel.co.uk. We're very active on Instagram, particularly at our Stockport club. And you'll get a really good flavor of our community spirit through our Instagram profile because you can see the types of people who are playing there. And I'm really encouraged to see that we've attracted a very high participation from ethnic minority groups and women. So we're probably 20% of our membership base come from ethnic minority groups at the moment, which is brilliant because they have found it difficult over the years to engage with sports. And I think, again, if we look at padel, it has a wonderful opportunity to be the sport for everyone, not just for a few. So go to our Instagram account. We're pretty active on LinkedIn as well. And we are completely changing our brand, but we're not changing who we are and what we stand for.
Is there something I haven't asked you that you want to mention?
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered some good ground. It's been quite cathartic to talk like this about the business of padel, but also my own involvement in it. But no, thank you for asking such interesting questions.
Thank you for taking the time. Really enjoyed these 40 minutes here. So I like to end with a networking question, which is who from your network do you think would be a good guest on this podcast?
Oh, that's a good question. Do you know Ian Colligan in the UK?
No.
So Ian runs a company called iPadel, and they are probably the best league and tournament organizers in the UK for padel. And Ian is a very interesting guy. I would highly recommend you having a chat with him.
Yeah, sounds like a very good guest. I keep that in mind. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to be on Sports Management Podcast.
Thank you, Marcus, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Sports Management Podcast. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. Also, feel free to leave a comment about what you thought about this episode. If you want to get in contact with me, send an email to sportsmpodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram @sportsmpodcast.